I did say these weeks that, getting from week 7 or part 7 of this series to part 9 on Easter, you need to be able to come on Holy Thursday and Good Friday. So thank you for being here tonight as we continue to look at Mark's gospel, as we continue into this set of the upper room as well when you think about it. So we're looking at tonight, Dinner Reservations, Last Call. As we look at that 14th chapter, looking at several verses 12 through 26. Understand, and I want you to consider this when you think about this. This is indeed Jesus' final dinner here on earth with his disciples in that earthly form. And he's with them in this upper room. And sometimes you may have that devotional, no, it's called the upper room, and you think, what does that mean? It just means an upper part to the house which they had prepared ready for them. But when I think about this upper room and the focus, often when you come to a Holy Thursday service, you may have even heard of it as Maundy Thursday. Not Monday, but Maundy Thursday service. And that really is just a Latin term that means commandment. And it's there in the upper room where we hear of this new commandment that Jesus gives them from John's discourse in the 13th chapter, discourse. And he says, to love one another. And there have been times when I've preached on Holy Thursday, Maundy Thursday, where I preach on that very new command. Or maybe, too, you think about servanthood when you think of Holy Thursday. Where it's in these moments, have you ever heard of why we wash each other's feet as servants and servanthood? We get it from the upper room discourse. And John 13, again, is where it's actually told. So sometimes when we have Holy Thursday, we even have some churches that wash feet on a night like tonight. But also there's the fact that in John's gospel also, one of the most powerful words of comfort come from the upper room. Let not your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. He says that to them in that moment. We hear it from John's gospel, and I've heard it, and I've said it multiple times to many people in difficult times. There he is, ready to face his own death, and he gives these powerful words of comfort. I've said them many times in many funerals, even my own father's. Just a few weeks ago, we read and we opened the service from John chapter 14. Powerful words from that upper room. But we're not talking about that either this evening. Another powerful thing that we hear from John's gospel is remain in Jesus, where he gives us this image or picture for us. And I love images that he would give and stories that he would tell and said, look, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Stay connected to me. And that's a powerful thing that we sometimes talk about on this night as well. And of course, we gather tonight to celebrate Holy Communion that was done in that upper room. But can I say, if we're going to look at Mark's gospel tonight, we're not going to talk about that. It's very interesting when you look at Mark's gospel where he seems to limit what he says and focus on one thing. But as a disciple, if you're here tonight, you may not like it. I mean, so much so that John and his gospel adds so much more to it, but Mark, as we know from the synoptic gospels, is primary, meaning what was added in Matthew and Luke were kind of added to support it, but Mark was the primary one. It was the first one that was used by many disciples, and so he focuses on something very, very challenging, and we're going to look at that. Tonight, we're going to focus on the last call made by Jesus. What? Because maybe what you're thinking about right now is, you know what last call means. Or maybe you don't, and hopefully you don't maybe. But last call, if you know by definition, like in a bar or a restaurant, it's the time when the customers are told they can order one more drink or one more thing of food before the kitchen closes or the bar closes. Last call. But that's not what we mean when you look at this title tonight. Yeah, I purposely and many times will play on words when I do messages, and I purposely will do that to hopefully it sticks, makes it a little more sticky for your head tonight to think about this last call, because we're not talking about that type of last call, but rather Jesus often made calls, have you ever heard this, like predictions. Jesus made calls on things. You ever make a call on something? I predict that such and such is going to win on opening day in baseball. You predict things. You make a call on what's going to happen. Jesus seemed to do this often about future events. And in this upper room, and by the way, up there is the picture of what more than likely it looked like with the tables up there. The Last Supper picture, one of the worst illustrations of what the Last Supper could have been like. And they even and I say this every Holy Thursday. If you've ever been to one of my Holy Thursday services, the Last Supper picture that you see as a painting is a terrible depiction of what the Last Supper would have looked like. Instead, they would have been around triclinium tables, 3 tables, lying or reclining almost as they lay. That's how they ate at that time period. That's why it was important, guess what? To wash feet. Because your feet were close to someone else's face, and it would stink. Therefore, they took the time, and Jesus took the time and washed their feet that night. So understand, get Da Vinci's picture out of your head. And I say that every year. That's what it would have more looked like. Tables like that, closer together, more intimate setting, the lying down on pillows, and many times they would lay with one hand down and eat with the other hand. Therefore, also, when some of the conversations happen in the upper room, you say, well, didn't anyone else hear that? Well, maybe not, because literally they're talking into one another's ears and hearing things that way. But we're going to talk about this last call, or this prediction that Jesus seems to make. And we're going to look at, like I said, Mark's Gospel, the 14th chapter, looking at verses 12 through 26. It says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, here's a call, here's a prediction. Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. What? Oh, follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, the teacher asks, where is my guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples? Oh, he will show you a large room, look at this, upstairs. Do you see where we get the sense of the upper room? It's upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. Look what we see here. The disciples left, went into the city, and listen to this, and found things just as Jesus had told them. Guess what happened then? So they prepared the Passover. It's just like he said. It's another correct call by Jesus, by the way. He tells them to go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water. Now, if you don't know much about the ancient Near Eastern world, that would be weird. Because many times, most times, the people who would carry the jars of water would be the women. So the fact that Jesus throws out that prediction, oh, you're going into the city, into Jerusalem, when you're in there, when you see the guy carrying the water jar, is he serious? Is he right? Well, we'll see. So that prediction in and of itself is fascinating. That he sees that detail in advance, and that someone's going to be carrying it. But understand this too, it's easy for the disciples to what? Recognize. Because if you said, look for the woman carrying the jar of water, it's, the Passover is getting closer, all those people there, there's probably hundreds of women carrying jars of water. But he says, look for the man. That's weird, but it happened. It's a fascinating thing. What are the odds of that happening? Odd that a man would carry water in the ancient Near Eastern world. And then he says, oh, by the way, there's going to be this large upper room furnished and ready for them to share the Passover. What? We've been outside in Bethany, coming back in and out. Who's going to have a big upper room ready for all of us? But it happened just like he said. Correct call, 100%. And it says it right there in the scriptures. What they find? Things just as Jesus had told them. Fascinating. And Jesus has been predicting other things, right? At various different times, he's told them different things. So they shouldn't be surprised when Jesus makes a call on something else. But in the upper room, when they're up there and they're practicing, and after the feet have been washed, we get this last call or prediction from Jesus, which is astounding. And Mark, in his gospel, which is what we've been looking at these weeks, seems to only mention or talk about that, in addition to the communion that was shared, that supper, that Last Supper. It's fascinating. And that's where we're going to spend our time, because here's what happens. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12 while they were reclining at the table. See, do you get that now? You see, if you get the Da Vinci picture, what the heck does it mean they're reclining at the table? That's the way they did it. So while they were there reclining at the table, eating, he said, "Truly I tell you," this is going to happen, he says, "one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." Now at that point, if any of you were about to take a bite, whoops, I didn't eat with you, Jesus. They were saddened. And listen to this, because many of you may know this story. Who's the bad guy in this story? Who's the one that betrays Jesus? Yeah, you know it, Judas. But look at this. They were sad, not just Judas. They were sad. And look at this. And one by one, they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." That's shocking. Shocking that they would even say that. And he says, "It is one of the 12. When we think about the 12 disciples, these are the ones closest to Jesus. He replied, "One who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him." And, that he's predicted many times already, made calls about it to him already, all of them. "But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." The last call. It's interesting how Mark focuses on this. Freaks me out a little bit, actually. John, you see all these beautiful things, and you expect when you come to a Holy Thursday, that's what you'll focus on. But we have made a commitment to go through Mark's gospel, and Mark focuses on the betrayal. "Truly I tell you," he says, "one of you will betray me." He says it in verse 18. What a call. And all of them that were there feel the sting. And maybe you're sitting here today as one of Jesus' disciples. You're like, I want to leave. Because that's what we're going to focus on tonight. This is always a nice service where sometimes Pastor Mark will wash somebody's feet or we'll do communion. It'll be real sweet and it's not so bad. And I don't have to get into this. But tonight, we're looking at the last call. And it's scary when he says, "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me." But there's something there that Mark puts in there, and he makes it and emphasizes it for that every disciple that gathers on a Holy Thursday should spend some time thinking about, to really think about, because it's rough. In the Greek, when you hear this word betrayal, as you get a sense of it, this Greek word is up there. Paradidomi is the word that's up there in the Greek, and that's what the New Testament was written in. But it means this. Para means from close beside. And didia means hand over. So if you really want to translate that word, betrayal, it's to hand over someone close to you. That's what gets a little scary about this, right? Because the betrayal that Jesus is talking about is with all the 12 who are supposed to be what? Close with him. They have spent those 3 years giving up everything to go with him and travel day in and day out. And one of the reasons I like the Chosen series is they show you that day in and day out stuff. Setting up tents, making dinner, and this is every day the daily things that we sometimes have to do. They were close to him. Then they saw everything that he had done too. All the healings, all the driving out of demons, all the miracles, the water, that they changed to wine. And when the sea is crazy and they're all going nuts in the boat, it's Jesus that stands up and with his words in his hands, he calms the sea. They were close. How close do you think they were that night and afraid, but they were glad Jesus was with them? But in this betrayal, he says something, and what's scary about this is that we know the story, and you can walk out here and go, Judas is the guy. That makes it easy. But when you think about this part of the story, and every single disciple that was there, is it me? They literally thought about it. That scares me because what that says, and maybe Mark is trying to, all his disciples, even those that gather all these years later, if you call yourself a disciple of Christ tonight, he's asking you that question too. Whew. And I will tell you, as a pastor of the church, I've seen people who were close to Jesus walk away, leave. I'm not talking about going to another church because they like the music and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about where they literally walk away from their faith and they leave Jesus. Look at the definition of what it says for that word betrayal. Someone who was close beside, they hand Jesus over, thinking, I'm done with my faith. That is a real call for each of us tonight here. Each of us to look at that and focus on that as Mark makes it his focus. And it's important for all of us to think, am I a betrayer? Would I hand Jesus over? If something happened that I didn't like with my faith or some sort of trial or obstacle or thing that comes, will I betray and hand over Jesus and I'm done with all of this? What would it take? I mean, if you were here on Palm Sunday, we focused in verses 1 to 12. And remember, it was Jesus who was anointed by a woman who put nard all over him. And Judas gets upset and even says at that point, he decides, that's it, I'm done with this guy. That's an easy one. And it's so easy for us. And it really, I got to tell you, when I started saying, I don't want to preach this, God. I don't want to spend the time talking about this because this gets too harsh, too hard of a reality for a Holy Thursday. It's supposed to be nice. Wash some feet, Mark. That's easy. Even if your feet are ticklish, that's easy. But coming up with the reality that all of us, like Mark lays out in his gospel, says, is it you? Or could it be you? Could it be me? Things get tough. Sometimes things happen in our lives where we too want to just give up on all of this and walk away. That's a call for all of us to think about on this Holy Thursday. Because, can I just say it, all hell breaks loose after this meal. And what does every one of those disciples who it's on me, Peter who bravely declares something, all of them scatter. They all go running away. So there is a little bit of betrayer in every one of them. And so it's worth all of us tonight being serious about this. Is there anything that we would do where we would walk away from Jesus? Surely you don't mean me. Is that what you're quick to say? Surely you don't mean me, Jesus. Not me. I've been going to church. I've come to this church for 45 years. I've sat in this pew. I've never missed a Holy Thursday service. Surely not me. Or I'm a pastor. Surely not me. But as I studied Mark's gospel and I just focused on that last call, I stopped. And I prayed and said, I hope it's not me. And I prayed for you as taking the time to come, because maybe you even felt a little good about, see, look at the church. These are the real disciples here tonight, because the church isn't full. These are the 30 or 30-some people that show up on a Holy Thursday service. We're the close ones. Someone who's close, because that's who he was talking to that night. Not the person that was on the fringe or the person that was there when he fed 5,000 people and then they never came back. But he was talking to his disciples that night. So bring it into your hearts as to something to really ponder, to think about. Because here's something else to think about. You know, when we get here to this part of the story in this upper room, the people of Israel, Their hearts are hardened in many ways to the things of God. And remember that in many ways they abandoned. That's why they even ended up in exile, if you know anything about the nation's history. And then they come back and they put all these goofy laws about everything in place that people don't mess up and they're so worried about, but their hearts are hardened. And it's in the next part of this story where it's the religious leaders, the highest priests, of the nation, is the one who's betraying Jesus. Their hearts were hardened. What? And then I think about also Pharaoh. What? That's like a really old story, Pastor Mark. Oh, but what are they there celebrating? Someone shout it out. The Passover. What is the story of the Passover? Multiple times Moses comes to the Pharaoh of Egypt and says, "Let my people go." And he starts sending these plagues. And I often hear some Christians will say this to me, if Lord would just show me a miracle, I would believe. And plague after plague, miracle after miracle goes to the nation of Egypt, and they're getting hit over again. And Pharaoh, his heart's not getting softer to God, it's hardening. And he says, "Nope, I'm done with this." And then, therefore, God says the last one is, "Go strike down the firstborn of everyone in the nation. And anyone in Egypt, unless they have the blood of the Lamb on the door." Another thing that I read this morning about the whole Passover event was when death was going through the streets, it didn't go in the house, did it? To see who was in there. Oh, these are the real close ones. We'll back out. We won't go in there. No, it simply looked for the blood of the Lamb on the door and then passed. And so it's an important thing for all of us to see that tonight as well. That is not you or I and how much we try and do for the Lord. It's that we're covered by the blood of the Lamb. Never forget that. Never forget that. And he would pass by. But Pharaoh's heart, it was hardened. And of course they said, one by one they asked. They were worried about their own hearts. Now intentionally, tonight, is anyone else thinking just a little bit like I was this week when I was preparing this? And maybe they find themselves, at least silently, I'm not going to say it out loud, is it me, God? 5 years from now, when something that I don't like happens to me or my family, am I going to hand you over? Because tonight's a good night to think about that and to think how important it is to stay close to Jesus. And of course, Judas. Right? We know he's the one. You already knew that tonight if you've ever gone to church. Judas is the betrayer. He's the one that hands him over to Jesus. But if you're like me and I hear about all these names, it could be any one of us. In what way am I allowing my heart to be hardened to the things of God? But Judas is the one who is truly the one to betray Jesus. So it's a ponder tonight. It's a question worth asking. What is the condition of your heart toward God? Because it makes all the more importance for you to come and share in this communion tonight, the giving of the bread, Jesus' body, and his cup, which is the blood. So that you find yourself in that, so that if death ever comes your way or your betrayal comes, it's that it'll pass over you because you're covered in the blood of the Lamb. You partake in the bread and the cup. But it's worth thinking about tonight. Judas the betrayer. Because if you're like me then, I thought about this before. What happened to him? What happened to him? He saw everything else, did everything else like the other disciples. What happened to his heart? And sometimes as your pastor, I look out at you and the people that come, and then I see people disappear, and they literally leave the church. I think sometimes, what happened? What happened that they lost their faith and they gave up on Jesus? And it hurts. And it makes me think about Jesus that night in the moment where all hell's about to break loose and he's sitting there with the one who's going to betray him. You know, the one that's been with him throughout all this. You know, even when he came back after healing people himself, and he's going to be the one to betray him. It had to hurt. It had to hurt. We have this misconception, oh yeah, Judas, we got it. It's a story we've heard all of our years growing up. But what happened to his heart? Was it that final spilling out of the oil in the Mark's Gospel that we looked at on Palm Sunday? Is that the final straw? That's it, I'm done with the guy. I mean, that's what it kind of portrays it as that. And then Jesus says something to me that I struggle with. And as I studied this passage, I just was like, ugh. And I'm going to give you that sense too. If you're already feeling tense, let's get a little more tense. Because imagine how tense it was that night. Why would it have been better for him that he was not born? Because of all the disciples, those who followed Jesus, the betrayal had to come from somebody. And I bet you all of us would say tonight, oh, I hope it's not me. Because Jesus even says to this disciple, it's better that you weren't even born. And that gets challenging. That gets real challenging as to what he would say. So I found this quote, by this DJ, this pastor. He says, do we blame God? Because that's what can happen at this. Because some people will look at Pharaoh. If you go back to the Exodus story and you read it in the book of Exodus, it said, God hardened his heart. And then when you read the story of Judas, you start to think, well, his heart was hard, and maybe God had something to do with that because somebody had to betray him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been crucified. But you sure hope it wasn't you. But in response to this, is we can shift the blame, and we can shift and blame God, because if we're honest, many times when people have something happen to them, death of somebody they love, a betrayal by a friend, something that happens, they will look at God and blame him. And so I think there's something more in this Judas story. And some people will look at this and say, well, it's God's fault that Judas had to be the one to be killed. But Judas, was born, was he not? He was there. I mean, God could have done something about that. If he was the one who shouldn't have been born, God could have just stopped him from being born. But God ordained that he would be the one. So it isn't better or ultimately good for him. Why did God ordain his existence then? And I think DJ gets into this. He's a pastor and theologian, by the way. He says, I think his existence is ordained and actual so that those who are saved from their sins and for God, look at this, they see and they savor the glory of God's mercy seen in the light of Judas who was condemned. Meaning the reason Mark focuses on this so that you can get a good sense of this and say, praise God for his mercy. And when I read that article that he posted as a blog post a couple years ago, he gave some verses. And this is how I'll close tonight, because this will be the last call. And you actually will hear the word in the Greek for the word call there. We'll turn to Romans chapter 9, verses 22 to 26. Talking about this blame sense. Because it's Paul, the apostle, one of the apostles that were close to God. He said, what if God, he asked, and there's two questions he asked. And often, if you've been through my sermons for a while, I ask pondering questions every week, every sermon, pretty much. But Paul has these great two questions. He goes, what if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath? Let's pause there for a moment. Because I think what Jesus is saying here, or even what Paul is putting through the words for him to write, is that for every one of those situations that we ran across tonight, did God judge these people quickly with his wrath and his power? No, he bore them with great patience. Because if you know the nation of Israel, if you look at it, was not just a few warnings, it's hundreds of years of prophets shouting at the people, repent and turn back to God. Year after year, sin after sin that he watched, and walking away from God, he's sending people to say, come back, come back. Was God wrong in doing that? I don't think so. Pharaoh, as we talked about tonight too in the book of Exodus, I mean, is it a wonder or maybe a possibility that God sent all those plagues so that maybe after 2, Pharaoh would have said, let him go? But he has to keep going on and wading through these difficult things. And God was very patient even with Pharaoh. What about Judas, if we're talking about him? Because Judas, if he came on early in the scenes with the other disciples, he and Saul, we already mentioned this, Saul went through everything else that all the other disciples went through. It wasn't, oh, Judas, you stay back because you're a bad guy here. He saw and walked and was with and ate and dined and saw the miracles over and over again. And I think this is key. Because when God happens to show his wrath or his judgment, and even in the case of the nation, on Pharaoh or Judas, it was done out of great patience. And every person that's here tonight who may be walking and playing with their sin, I think this is worth hearing. God has great patience with us and even allows us to sin, but he does have patience for the objects of his wrath. And then he goes on to say, prepared for destruction. Then Paul goes on with another question. What if, again he says, what if? He did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory. And then he goes on to say this. Even us, meaning who's here tonight? Even us, whom he also, here's the word, called. Not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. And he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people. And I will call her my loved ones who are not my loved one. And in this very place where it is said to them, you are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. And so I think in conclusion with what we're looking at tonight in this last call is, what do you choose? His wrath or his mercy? His wrath or his mercy? Because that's why I came. I came for his mercy. I came for his love. And I came to recognize that, Lord, it may be me. But Lord, don't let it be me. I seek your mercy. I need your forgiveness. I need it desperately. And it's not surprising. And then, after sharing those moments, he gives them the Last Supper. Does that make more sense? Because they needed to hear that. Because all of them were hurting at that point. Oh man, that hurts. But there's a way. Of the blood of the Lamb, like the Passover, and on the night of the Passover, he's saying, my body, my blood, poured out for you to receive my mercy. Not wrath, but mercy. Those not covered by the blood of Jesus, not covered by him breaking our body, will be subject to his wrath. Choose his mercy. Would you pray with me, please? Father, we thank you for this awesome privilege to be in your holy word. And Lord, spending time in Mark's gospel tonight to focus on something tonight that may be easily overlooked or part of the story that we may know already so easily or so well. It's Judas. It's Judas. But tonight, oh God, we take some moments to come before you recognizing or saying, is it me? Is it me? And then you give an amazing meal for his disciples, for those that are close, to keep remembering, to keep taking part of until your glorious return. Amen.